Chapter 18. The plane was a modified B-2 stealth bomber, modified to carry paratroops rather than bombs. It hadn't been modified enough to be comfortable. The seats were small and hard, the air was dry and cold, and there wasn't anything to drink but water and fruit juice. Wilcox and Lassen had complained about that for most of the last few hours, making the same stupid wisecracks over and over before they finally ran out of steam and shut up. Schaefer didn't care whether the seats were comfortable or not. The only thing that had been bothering him had been Wilcox and Lassen bitching about it, so he couldn't get some sleep. Now that they had stopped, he had been enjoying the silence, up until Phillips emerged from the forward hatch and said, "Well, that's it. We've crossed over into Russian airspace, and the pilot's taking us down low and slow for the drop. ETA at the drop site is 3 minutes. Schaefer stretched and stood up. "You sound pretty damn nonchalant about it," he remarked. "I thought we spent all those billions on defense because we were worried about stuff like Russian radar." Phillips snorted. "They can't even make a good copying machine. You think we can't beat their radar net? The plane's part of what we spent those billions on, and we got our money's worth." "You think you got our money's worth," Schaefer corrected him. "We won't know for sure until we see whether they shoot us down." Phillips ignored him and gestured to Captain Lynch. Lynch got to his feet. "All right, you crybabies," he said to Wilcox and the others. "Time to earn some of that exorbitant salary we've been paying you. Make your final equipment check, and let's boogie." He tripped the switch, and the hatch slid open. Wind howled. Nothing but grey darkness showed through the opening, though. Schaefer stepped up closer. "Looks like a long drop," Lynch said. "Getting nervous, cop?" Schaefer smiled a tight little smile. "Yeah," he said. "I forgot to set my VCR to record this week's Melrose Place. Maybe you'll let me watch yours when we get back." Lynch glared at him for a moment, then turned away in disgust. "All right, boys," he said. "Do it." One by one, the 7 men leapt from the plane, first the 4 enlisted men, then Schaefer, then Lynch, and finally Phillips. Frigid air screamed up around Schaefer. His goggles protected his eyes, and his high-tech snowsuit protected his body. But the rest of his face stung fiercely, then went numb as he plummeted through space. He jerked at the handle on his chest. Schaefer's chute opened just the way it was supposed to when he pulled the cord, blossoming into a big, off-white rectangle above his head and jerking him suddenly upward, turning his downward plunge into a gentle glide. But the cold didn't go away. He grimaced, then tugged experimentally on the lines, and discovered that yes, it steered exactly as it should. So far, so good. He looked down, trying to pick out a good landing spot, but all he could see was blank greyness. At first he thought his goggles had fogged up, but he could still see the other men and their parachutes clearly. There wasn't anything wrong with his vision. There just wasn't anything to see in the frozen wasteland below. Well, one patch of snow was as good as another, he thought. He adjusted his lines slightly to keep from drifting too far away from the rest of the team, then just waited for his feet to touch down. As he descended, he looked around at the others. Phillips had really come all this way with them, which surprised Schaefer. The general had to be in his 60s, which was pretty damn old to be jumping out of airplanes over enemy territory, or hunting alien monsters. Phillips had guts anyway. Schaefer looked down again. The ground was coming up surprisingly fast. His feet were mere yards above the surface, and Schaefer concentrated on turning his controlled fall into a run, getting out from under his chute before it collapsed onto the ice. Then he was down on one knee in a puff of powder. The chute spread out behind him. He stood up, dropped the harness, and began reeling the whole thing in. He could tell that the chute was scraping up several pounds of snow, but he didn't worry about it. The others were landing around him. Because of his size, Schaefer had been the first to strike ground. Captain Lynch came down less than 15 feet from where Schaefer stood. Lynch threw Schaefer a glance, then looked around for the others. He spotted one of them helping another up. "Lassen!" he called. "What happened to Wilcox?" "I think he landed on his head," Lassen shouted back. "Guess he didn't want to injure something important," Schaefer said. Lassen whirled and charged towards the detective, fists clenched. "We're through taking shit from you, Schaefer!" Lynch grabbed Lassen, restraining him. Schaefer didn't move. He said, "That's funny. I figured you were up for a lot more yet." "All right, that's enough," Phillips shouted from atop a snowbank. "We've got a job to do here." Lassen calmed enough that Lynch released him. The whole party turned to face Phillips. "There's an oil pipeline that runs just west of here, the Asima pipeline," he said. "Whatever it was we spotted landed right near it, north of here. There's a pumping station just 2 clicks from here, with a small garrison, some workmen and maybe a couple of geologists stationed there. That's the closest thing to civilization anywhere in the area. We'll take a look there, see what the Russians have been up to. If they've been doing anything with our visitors, they'll been working out of that station, because it's all they've got. Keep your mouths shut and your eyes open, and move it." Phillips turned and began marching, leading them towards the pumping station. No one bothered to say anything as they followed. For one thing, Schaefer thought, it was too damn cold to talk. The spiffy electric underwear really worked, and from the neck down he was as toasty warm as if he were home in bed. But the suit didn't cover his hands, or feet, or head, and his gloves and boots were plain old heavy-duty winter wear, with nothing particularly fancy or high-tech about them. He wore a thick woolen hood over his head, with a strapped-on helmet, and with his goggles on top of that. But most of his face was still bare, exposed to the Siberian wind, and it wasn't much better down here than it had been a mile up. It was like having his face stuck in a deep freeze. His body was warm, but his face was already just about frozen. His skin was dry and hard, the sweat and oil whipped away by the wind. When he opened his mouth, it was like gulping dry ice, burning cold searing his tongue and throat. His eyebrows felt brittle, his nostrils felt scorched. Odd, how intense cold burned like fire, he thought. He wondered how the hell Phillips could find his way through this frigid gloom. The night wasn't totally dark. A faint glow seemed to pervade everything, reflecting back and forth between the clouds and the snow, though Schaefer had no idea where it came from. Still, everything Schaefer could see looked alike, an endless rolling expanse of ice and snow. How did Phillips know exactly where they'd landed, or which way the pipeline lay? Schaefer supposed the general had his compass and some Boy Scout tricks. He seemed pretty confident. And he had good reason to be confident, Schaefer saw a few minutes later, when the radio tower of the pumping station came into view. Without a word, the soldiers spread out into scouting formation, the men on either end watching for Russian patrols or sentries, all of them moving forward in a stealthy crouch. Schaefer didn't bother. There wasn't any place to hide out here. If they were spotted, they were spotted. They weren't spotted, though, so far as Schaefer could see. They crested the final ridge and got a good long look at the pumping station. Grey, blocky buildings stood half buried in the drifting snow, arranged around the central line of the pipeline. All were dark. No lights shone anywhere. Nothing moved. The place looked dead. Of course, in the middle of a Siberian winter, Schaefer didn't exactly expect to see anyone playing volleyball or sunbathing on the roof, but this place had that indefinable something, that special air that marked abandoned, empty buildings. "Check out the door, sir," Lassen said, pointing. Lynch and Phillips both lifted their pairs of binoculars and looked where Lassen indicated. Schaefer squinted. He frowned and started marching down the slope, his M16 ready in his hands. "Hey, Schaefer!" Wilcox shouted. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "Down to take a good look at that door," Schaefer shouted back. "He's right," Phillips said, sliding his binoculars back in their case on his belt. "Come on, Together, the 7 Americans moved cautiously down the slope and up to the ruined east door. Schaefer didn't hurry. It was Lassen who reached the empty doorway first. "I'd knock, man," he said, "but I don't think anybody's home." Schaefer didn't respond. He turned aside to look at something, at a spot of colour in this dreary grey and white landscape. A drain pipe emerged from the base of a wall beneath the pipeline itself. The frozen puddle beneath the drain was dark red, the colour of dried blood. Or in this case, Schaefer thought, frozen blood. "Schaefer, over here," Phillips called. Schaefer turned and joined the others at the door. Jagged strips and fragments of steel lay on the snow. Only the hinges were still attached to the frame. Schaefer looked at those hinges, at the way they were twisted out of shape, and at the rough edges of the scattered pieces. "This was cut with a blade," he said. "It's steel, though. You don't chop through that with a pocket knife. And the way these hinges are bent. Whatever punched through here went from the outside in." He glanced at the bloody drain pipe. "They've been here," he said. "I can smell it." "Lynch, get some light in here," Phillips said. "We'll take a look inside." Lynch stepped forward with a high-powered flashlight. Cautiously, the party inched into the corridor. This took them out of the wind, but Schaefer noticed that inside the building didn't really seem much warmer than outside. The heat was off. Whatever might be the case elsewhere in the complex, this one building was dead and deserted. You didn't stay in an unheated building in weather like this. The power was off too. Flipping light switches didn't do anything. Lynch shone the light around, and almost immediately they spotted the blood on the wall and on the floor. It would have been hard to miss, really. There was so much of it. They glanced uneasily at each other, but no one said anything. What was there to say? "Down that way," Schaefer said, pointing to a side tunnel. Lynch glanced at Phillips for confirmation. The general nodded, and Lynch led the way around the corner, into the side passage. "Gennaro, you wait here," Phillips ordered one man, pointing at the corner. "You watch our rear." Gennaro nodded and took up a position at the T of the intersection. He stood and watched as his companions marched on down the corridor they had chosen. The 6 men emerged into the maintenance area, and Lynch shone the light around, then stopped, pointing the beam at a drying puddle of something reddish-brown. Slowly, he swung the light upward. "Oh my God," he said. Schaefer frowned. "Looks as if those bastards found some time to play," he said. Lynch moved the light along the row of corpses. To the men below it seemed to go on forever. 3, 5, 8, 12 dead bodies hung there. 12 human bodies. And to one side, 2 dead dogs. Crooked lines of something sparkled here and there on their sides, and hung from their heads and dangling fingertips, giving them a surreal appearance. Icicles of frozen blood and sweat. "Tst!" Gennaro called. Schaefer whirled. The others, fascinated by the grisly sight overhead, were slower to react. Gennaro was in the corridor, pointing back towards the demolished external door. "Something's moving out there," he whispered. "I heard engines." "Damn," Phillips said. He glanced around, clearly trying to decide who to station where. "We might need to stay together, General," Schaefer said. "If it's those things, they're experts at picking off sentries and stragglers." Phillips nodded. "Come on then, all of you," he said, leading the party back up the passage. A moment later, they were in the outer corridor, grouped along the walls. Schaefer peered out into the dim greyness of the outside world. "I don't see anything," he said. "I'm sure," Gennaro said. "Over that way." He pointed towards the pipeline. "Come on," Phillips said. Together, the party moved back out into the wind and cold, inching along the building's exterior wall in the direction that Gennaro had indicated. A sharp crack sounded, and then the singing whine of a ricochet. A puff of powdered concrete sprinkled down over Schaefer's modified M16. "Drop your weapons immediately! All of you!" Someone shouted in heavily accented, high-pitched English. "You're under arrest!" Schaefer turned and saw the line of soldiers crouching at the top of the slope, rifles trained on the Americans. The Russians were used to winter conditions. They'd been able to move into position undetected. And now they had the Americans trapped against a blank wall, completely unsheltered and vulnerable. And there was no telling how many of them there were. They could have an entire division behind that little ridge. Schaefer put down his weapon, slowly and gently. At least, he thought, these were human enemies. They might have a common foe.